Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time, Early fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, performing admirable service in that battle and the campaign. Now we move with Early late into 1863 and into the Overland Campaign in 1864. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Once back in Virginia, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac contested the movements of the other. In October, Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, sought to turn the Union Army's flank and drive them northward, hoping to land a significant blow to the enemy. What resulted was the Bristow Station campaign. As A.P. Hill's corps moved around the flank of the Union Army, Ewell's corps, with Early's division in the lead, gave chase as the enemy began pulling back toward Washington. Early nipped at the heels of the Union Army as Hill's men attacked a Federal contingent at Bristow Station. The battle was a defeat for the Confederacy, but the Federal Army was forced to withdraw from the area. However, that movement would only be temporary. The Army of the Potomac would again come to confront Lee's army along the Rappahannock River. Along that river, Hill's corps protected the left flank while Ewell's acted as the right flank. One of the most precarious sectors along that Rappahannock line was under Early's control, because the high bluffs on the river on the north side made Early's position south of the river untenable. Lee moved Early north of the river, but this came at a risk. With the river to Early's back, a determined attack by the enemy could spell disaster for the Confederate division. Under orders from Lee, Early kept only one brigade across the river to let the rest of the army know if a Union advance was to happen and to put up resistance against a Federal crossing of the river. On November 7th, 2 brigades of Union soldiers attacked Early's line. Early rushed another brigade across the pontoon bridge to shore up his line, but the Union attack broke it and scattered his troops. Out of the 2,000 Confederates on the north side of the river, over half of them became prisoners. It was a humiliating defeat for Early, Lee, and the whole Confederate Army. It was around this time that in the late fall and winter of 1863 and into 1864 that a member of Early's staff described him as a tinkerer. He was always trying to fix something at headquarters himself and did a pretty good job of it. But on one occasion, one of his staff members, named John Daniel, found the general wrestling with a table trying to fix the legs. Early asked, "John, I have a great mind to curse. Do you think it would do any good?" John responded, "No, sir. I do not curse myself and do not like to hear anyone else do so." Early enlisted another staff member to make a bedstand. The staffer remembered, "We cut some pine poles and made the legs, then nailed them together with some planks, and then in Robin Crusoe fashion we cut some cedar poles and made a spring bottom to it." He calls it his patent night cottage bedstead. In late November and early December 1863, the Army of the Potomac began to launch a winter offensive against the Confederates. George Meade, the Union Army commander, was spurred by Washington to move against Lee's army. The resultant campaign would be called the Mine Run Campaign. During this campaign, Ewell would go on sick leave, and this raised Early to temporary corps command until Ewell returned. When the Union Army moved across the Rapidan River, Early sent his corps against the Federal troops in an attempt to block them. When Union troops threatened to get behind him, he sent Edward Johnson's division to deal with them. The tangled mess of the wilderness prevented any visibility beyond a few yards, and Early was unaware how the fight was going along his line. When Johnson pushed back the Federals in his sector, a lull crept over the battlefield. Lee, in an odd moment, didn't pursue the Federals as aggressively as he normally would. When he finally decided to outflank them, the rebels found the area vacated, and the Union Army pulled back across the Rapidan River. However, Early and his men found a devastated area, particularly around a tan yard. He found the tannery, the tanner's house, and the leather and hides all destroyed and burned. Early stated, "Such wanton barbarity could have been perpetrated only by a cowardly foe, stung with mortification at the ridiculous termination of so pretentious an expedition." By mid-December 1863, Ewell came back to command the corps, and Early went back to command of his division. The winter months were playing havoc on Early's arthritis, and he began to wear a woolen skull cap, a cloth overcoat that went all the way down to his heels, and that same cloth wrapped around his lower legs. Also that winter, Early was to get an independent command for a short time. A large Union cavalry raid aimed to cut the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad at Salem, Virginia, when Early and 2 infantry brigades detached from A.P. Hill's corps and 2 cavalry brigades from Jeb Stuart's cavalry corps made it to Stanton, Virginia. The Union cavalry under William Averill made it to Salem, Virginia. Both Early and the Department of Southwest Virginia commander Samuel Jones attempted to cut off and trap Averill's men. However, Early found his cavalry lacking, those already in the valley under John M. Bowdoin in particular. The bulk of the Federal cavalry made the raid, destroying a great amount of materiel, then headed back north. Averill was able to escape numerous attempts to trap him, but he did lose a great number of wagons to Confederate troopers while attempting to cross a river. Nevertheless, Early was furious at the inability of his men to put a stop to the raid. Into January, Early began to report on the horrible conduct and abilities of Imboden and his command. The situation got so bad that Imboden requested a court of inquiry to clear his name. Because Imboden served under Early, the petition for a court of inquiry had to go through Early, which Early happily signed off on, believing that the court would find Imboden inefficient in his duties. When the request got to Lee, Lee disapproved of the formation of a court of inquiry. Nevertheless, Early was beginning to make significant waves within the Confederate Army. In late January, Early launched an expedition into the northern reaches of the Shenandoah Valley in West Virginia. His movement took him to Moorefield, and when the Confederate columns of infantry and cavalry marched through the city, a sight brought a smile to Early's face and those of his men. A crowd of beautiful ladies came out to greet them, having hardly seen a Confederate in a very long time. Early's cavalry under Thomas Rosser did most of the damage to the Federal infrastructure, destroying parts of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and its bridges and capturing about 800 head of cattle. This exemplary performance made Early nearly forgive Rosser for an infraction perpetrated shortly before the raid. Rosser was a newlywed and put his wife up in Stanton when he was transferred to the Shenandoah Valley. Before the expedition set off, Rosser went to visit her without permission. Early undoubtedly gave him a tongue lashing. He had been fighting having wives in the field since the beginning of the war, and he also reported Rosser's actions to Lee. Rosser called Early a miserable old rascal, in a letter to his wife following the incident. An incident that, if Early had found out, would have brought misery on Rosser also involved that cavalryman's wife. Betsy asked Rosser to procure her some items. Rosser apparently sent out some of his troopers in search of these items that he never listed, and the letter she wrote is lost, so we don't know what she asked for, but Rosser used his own troopers to find her these items, and he brought them to her on his next visit. One can only imagine what Early might have done had he known what Rosser did. Once the valley became a little more quiet, Early requested leave to go back home for a few weeks, which Lee granted. He left for home in mid-February. When he returned to the Army of Northern Virginia in late March, Early wore a handsome new uniform with a black plume in his hat that made General Lee state that Early looked like a gay cavalier, a far cry from how Lee usually referred to Early as his bad old man. When Early returned, he found Ewell, his corps commander, still ailing. Although he could ride, the wooden leg made walking difficult, and the corps commander suffered great pain from it. He had also fell from his horse in January, and was still recovering. Early may have anticipated himself taking over the corps if Ewell found it too difficult to campaign. Early also found that Ewell and his new wife were living pretty far from the corps, which meant that Early took care of most of the corps' matters. Like with Rosser, Early's dislike of wives in the Army may have placed Ewell in an unfavorable light for Early. Mrs. Ewell seemed to run the entire headquarters. One observer stated that she manages everything from the general's affairs down to the couriers who carries his dispatches. All say they are under petticoat government. Apparently, Early let his thoughts on the matter come out, and he began to spout his distaste for wives in camp and launch into tirades about the abilities of Ewell. Ewell quickly put Early under arrest for conduct subversive of good order and military discipline. When Lee got word about the arrest and heard Ewell's reasoning for it, Lee said Early's words were inexcusable, but rescinded the order, deciding to settle the matter between himself and the two men in private. We don't know any specifics because it was kept quiet to keep the integrity and morale of the Army together, but it definitely caused a rift between Early and Ewell. Spring 1864 brought a new campaign season. Lee still had to fight the Army of the Potomac, but there was a new general in that army, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant just recently took command of all Union forces and made his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac. That army's commander remained George Meade, but now Meade had Grant looking over his shoulder. In early May, the Union Army crossed the Rapidan River in an attempt to get around Lee's flank and bring him to battle. Lee wanted to push into the wilderness and engage the enemy there to reduce the numerical advantage enjoyed by the Federals. Ewell's corps marched on the Orange Turnpike with Edward Johnson and Robert Rodes' division in front, with Early's division bringing up the rear. When they deployed, Early took up a position on the left. The 5th and 6th Corps of the Army of the Potomac assaulted Early's lines, but Early held firm. On May 6th, John Brown Gordon, one of Early's best brigade commanders, came to Ewell and Early and suggested a plan of attack that would hit the Union Army in the flank and roll up its line. Gordon found after going on 2 reconnaissance missions that the Union hadn't protected their right flank and there were no troops in support of them either. He outlined the plan to Ewell and Early of swinging his and another brigade around and driving the Union soldiers south, but Early said that Ambrose Burnside's corps was in support of the 5th and 6th Corps, so it was too risky. The next few hours and moments have become controversial because there are conflicting reports. Lee requested for Ewell to attack to relieve pressure on A.P. Hill's corps and James Longstreet's corps on the Orange Plank Road. According to Gordon, Lee rode to Ewell's headquarters where Early and Gordon were and was told about Gordon's plan. Lee asked Ewell and Early why it hadn't been acted upon, but no answer was sufficient for Lee. Also, according to Gordon, Lee personally ordered the attack. That version comes from Gordon's post-war reminiscences. In Gordon's official report, he said that Early ordered the attack. Ewell's report and Early's autobiography match, stating that Ewell issued the attack order. Nevertheless, Gordon made the attack and gained great success, but the attack slowed down, and the Union reinforcements began putting up stiff resistance as Confederates made their way south in the attack. The Battle of the Wilderness was a bloodbath, but Grant and Meade wouldn't turn back after being blocked in the wilderness. They continued southeast toward Richmond, Virginia. Lee would give chase, but he needed to make some generals temporary commanders of 2 of his corps. Longstreet had been wounded by his own men in the wilderness, so his corps needed a temporary commander. Early was on that list, but Richard Anderson would take temporary command. A.P. Hill, suffering from prostatitis, became incapacitated after the wilderness. Thus, his corps also needed a temporary replacement. Lee chose Early for that role. Early commanded Hill's corps during the bloody fight at Spotsylvania Courthouse, with Early eventually commanding the Confederate right against Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps. Early threw back repeated attacks and held off the Union from advancing on the flank and rear of Lee's line. However, the situation was odd for Early. He was commanding a corps whose commanders he didn't know well, and that corps' permanent commander was always close at hand, observing from an ambulance wagon. Early didn't get true control of the corps because of Hill's close presence. Hill took back command of the corps after the close of the battle, and Early went back to division command, but that only lasted a few days. Ewell, suffering both physically and mentally from the constant fighting, was relieved, it was said temporarily, of command. Early assumed the role of corps commander on May 29th. Ewell, who felt better after a couple of days of rest, tried to return to the army, but Lee basically told him it wasn't a good idea for him to take control of the corps at this present time. Early made waves in the 2nd Corps, particularly with the staff he inherited from Ewell. Ewell's stepson was on Early's staff and wrote to his stepfather that, "Old Early did not ask me how you were, but I made my speech so that he will hear it. 2 of the best of the Signal Corps, the Wynn brothers, have applied to be relieved. Early set them to minding horses. They, being gentlemen, will not stand it. He is kicking up a row in everything he comes near. I intend to see little of Early, and will get along finely. He looks at me like a sheep stealing dog, out of the corner of his eye, and when I reported myself for duty this evening, was astonished at his peculiarity, very different from his usual manner." Early moved his corps toward a location called Cold Harbor, and engaged Union forces at Bethesda Church. In mid-June, Robert E. Lee called Early to his headquarters and informed him of an important assignment. He was to go into the Shenandoah Valley to rid that area of Union forces. The last Federal contingent to enter the valley had been defeated at the Battle of New Market, but a new general now commanded the 8,000-man Federal force in the valley. His name was David Hunter. Hunter was a unique individual. One historian wrote of him, "For a soldier of his day, Hunter's fanaticism was extreme. it would significantly influence the campaign to come. His treatment of non-combatants ran against the grain of the times, in an era when tradition and the laws of war still drew a sort of line to protect non-combatants from the warrior's drawn blade. Hunter made war on civilians with a certain gusto. Many were the dwellings he ordered put to the torch. For someone like Early, this seemed to be the perfect opponent, because Early hated war against civilians. Early got his columns moving quickly, leaving out on June 13th for the Shenandoah Valley. One soldier wondered where he was headed, following Lee's bad old man, and wrote in a letter that he traveled along the road to who knows where, but he was confident that Early would carry the war to Africa to beat the Yankees if necessary. Hunter's army was pressing up the valley, taking Stanton, then Lexington, aiming for Lynchburg, a major hub on the railroad from Tennessee, and contained supplies and a Confederate hospital. Early marched his men nearly 80 miles in 4 days to Charlottesville, then put his men on trains to Lynchburg, arriving there on the 16th, with his men arriving the next day, just in time to intercept Hunter's attack on the city. Early's men were able to throw back the Union attacks. Hunter believed he was outnumbered and used the darkness of June 17th to pull his men back from Lynchburg and retreat. Early wasn't convinced that Hunter was retreating. He thought the Union general may be maneuvering around to the south to attack Lynchburg from that direction, or he could be moving to link up with Ulysses S. Grant outside of Richmond and Petersburg. Early soon discovered that Hunter was escaping and chased after him, but Hunter dove into the West Virginia mountains, aiming for Charleston. Instead of chasing him any further, Early turned north toward the Potomac River, asserting his dominance over the Shenandoah Valley as his columns wound north. Early described the scene. Houses had been burned and women and children left without shelter. The country had been stripped of provisions, and many families left without a morsel to eat. The time consumed in the perpetration of those deeds was the salvation of Lynchburg, with its stores, foundries, and factories, which were so necessary to our army in Richmond. At this point, Hunter was out of the valley and the region was somewhat safe. Early had two options. He could either return to Richmond to augment Lee's forces around Richmond and Petersburg, or he could move north and invade Maryland and threaten Washington, D.C., which would hopefully draw troops away from Grant's army, threatening Lee. Early chose to invade. After crossing the Potomac River, Union General Franz Sigel, commanding a Union contingent in Maryland, blocked Early's route. So Early resolved to move farther north to cut through the mountains in the same locations that Lee moved through the year before. As with the Gettysburg campaign and Lee's strict orders to harm no civilian property, Early likewise issued his own order for his men not to pillage. But, as one of his biographers explained, to these strictures against waging war on civilians, there was to be a characteristic exception: economic warfare waged by Jubal Early himself. Some of Maryland's most affluent citizens were to be shaken down. To soften his prospective victims up, the general ordered cavalry to ride hard through the countryside, generating an appearance of potency, and it was to be hoped striking fear into the hearts of armed Union foes and rich native burghers alike. Early targeted whole towns, sending some of his cavalry to Hagerstown, Maryland, where they were supposed to threaten the town with the torch if they did not receive $200,000. The cavalry commander, probably groggy from exhaustion, dropped a zero from the amount, making it $20,000, a sum easily scraped together from the citizens. It wasn't just money and supplies Early was after. He wanted to scare the North. He had his eyes on Washington, D.C.